I still don't know if what I did was right. Maybe I'm the asshole here, but after everything that happened, I just couldn't hold it in anymore. Let me start from the beginning. My dog Buddy died 3 days ago. He was a rescue, part lab, part mystery, and my best friend since I was 9. I came home from school and my mom was standing in the kitchen, her face pale. She didn't have to say anything, I just knew. The vet said it was a seizure, sudden and painless. I guess that's supposed to make it better, but all I could think about was how I wasn't there when it happened. My older brother Jake found me in the backyard that evening, sitting in Buddy's doghouse with his chewed-up leash in my hands. I'd been crying so hard my eyes were practically swollen shut. Jake leaned against the fence, smirking. "Seriously?" he said. "It's just a mutt. Man up." He kicked a pebble toward the doghouse, and it hit the roof with a sharp tink. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? Our parents have always babied Jake. He's 2 years older, but you'd think he was made of glass. 6 months ago, his girlfriend dumped him. Turned out she'd been cheating with some guy from her work. And ever since, the rest of us have had to tiptoe around his fragile mental state. That's Mom's phrase, not mine. So when I told her what Jake said about Buddy, she just sighed. "You know he's not himself right now," she said, stirring a pot of spaghetti like we were talking about the weather. Dad nodded along, muttering something about giving him space. That night, I overheard Jake on the phone with his friend. "Yeah, the little freak's still moping over that stupid dog," he said, laughing. "It's not like it's a person. You can just get another one." His voice was so casual, like he was discussing a broken video game controller. I stood outside his door, my fists clenched, until he added, "Pathetic." "Right?" I snapped. I don't even remember walking into his room. 1 second I was in the hallway, and the next I was shouting, "At least Buddy loved me. Your ex cheated because you're heartless." The words hung in the air like smoke. Jake froze, his phone still pressed to his ear. Mom rushed in, her eyes wide, and Dad followed, demanding I apologize for kicking him while he's down. I refused. Told them Jake hadn't apologized for mocking Buddy, so why should I? Jake slammed his door so hard the frame cracked. Dad took my phone as punishment for disrespect, and Mom handed me a box of tissues later, whispering, "You know how sensitive he's been since the breakup." I wanted to scream. Since when does sensitive mean you get to be cruel? The next day at school, Jake's friends started calling me Dog Boy. They'd bark when I walked by, and Jake would smirk like it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. When I got home, Buddy's food bowl was missing from its usual spot by the fridge. Jake shrugged and said he tossed it to stop the moping. I checked the trash cans, digging through coffee grounds and moldy leftovers, but it was gone. My grades started slipping. My history teacher pulled me aside after class, her voice soft. "Is everything okay at home?" For a second, I almost told her, but then I pictured Jake's smirk, Mom's tired eyes, Dad's disappointed frown, and I just shook my head. Things got worse. Dad found the journal I'd been hiding under my mattress. Pages filled with messy handwriting about how much I missed Buddy's bark, the way he'd nudge my hand with his nose when I stopped petting him. Dad flipped through it, his mouth tight. "This is an unhealthy obsession," he said. I didn't bother explaining that grief isn't a switch you can flip off. Jake started blasting music every night, heavy bass shaking the walls, to drown out my calls to Buddy's old shelter. I'd asked if they had any of his litter mates up for adoption, my voice trembling as I tried not to sound like a kid. The volunteer said no, but I kept calling anyway, just to hear someone say Buddy's name. Last Saturday, I woke up early, put on my shoes, and walked to the shelter without telling anyone. The smell of disinfectant hit me first, then the sound of barking. Sharp yips, deep woofs, a chaotic chorus that made my chest ache. A scrappy senior dog with a graying muzzle pressed his paw against the glass of his kennel. The shelter supervisor smiled when she saw me staring. "That's Rusty," she said. "He's been here 6 months. Nobody wants the old guys." I spent 2 hours sitting on the floor of Rusty's kennel, letting him sniff my hands while I told him about Buddy. He didn't wag his tail or jump around, just leaned against my leg, warm and steady. When I left, the supervisor asked if I'd come back next weekend. I nodded, already dreading the walk home. Jake was waiting on the porch. "Where'd you sneak off to?" he asked, his voice dripping with fake concern. I told him it was none of his business. He laughed, but it sounded hollow. Whatever, Mom's pissed. I don't know what happens next. Part of me wants to forgive him, to believe he's just hurting. But every time I close my eyes, I see Buddy's empty doghouse, hear Jake's laugh echoing in the dark. Maybe I'm the asshole. Maybe we both are. All I know is, I miss my dog. Now for the first update. A week ago, I posted about my brother Jake mocking me after our dog Buddy died. I didn't think things could get worse. I was wrong. Let me back up. After I told Jake his ex cheated because he's heartless, our house turned into a war zone. Jake started stealing from me. Small stuff at first. A hoodie, my earbuds. Then last Tuesday, I found $40 missing from my dresser. I'd been saving it to donate to Buddy's shelter. Jake didn't even deny it. "You owe me," he said, leaning against my doorway. "Everyone at school thinks I'm a joke because of your little outburst." His voice was calm, like he was explaining the weather. I went to our parents, assuming they'd finally see how unhinged he'd become. Instead, Mom rubbed her temples and said, "You provoked him, honey." Dad nodded, arms crossed. "You're both grounded until this nonsense stops." Grounded for having my money stolen. I stared at them, waiting for the punchline, but Jake just smirked and walked out. The next morning, I overheard Jake arguing on the phone in the garage. His voice was sharp, defensive. "I told you, I didn't screw up the alignment on purpose. It's not my fault. Karen's Prius handles like a shopping cart." A pause. "Suspended? Are you kidding me?" He kicked the tool cabinet, sending a wrench clattering to the floor. When he stormed inside, I blocked his path. "Lose your job?" I asked, trying not to sound as satisfied as I felt. He shoved past me. "This is your fault," he hissed. "If you hadn't been such a crybaby, I wouldn't have been distracted at work." His breath smelled like mint gum and something chemical. I wanted to laugh or scream. Instead, I said, "Maybe stop blaming everyone else for once." Dad made me apologize that night. "You started this," he said, arms folded like a disappointed judge. I looked Jake dead in the eye. "Sorry you got caught being a jerk." Jake's jaw twitched. Mom sighed. 3 days later, I found Crybaby keyed into my bike seat. The letters were jagged, like he'd done it fast. When I showed Mom, she glanced up from her laptop. "Just ignore him," she said, like we were discussing a mosquito bite. I wanted to shake her. Instead, I walked to the shelter. Rusty, the senior dog I'd been visiting, pressed his muzzle into my palm as soon as I sat down. His fur was patchy near the tail, and he had this habit of sighing like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. The supervisor, Marisol, smiled at us. "He's never taken to anyone like this," she said. I scratched behind Rusty's ears, his eyes half closed. "He's a good listener," I mumbled. When I got home, Jake was waiting. "Heard you're babysitting Grandpa's dog," he said, nodding at the shelter flyer in my hand. "He'll croak soon, too. Better stock up on tissues." His voice was flat, almost rehearsed. I didn't react, just walked to my room and locked the door. Later, I heard voices in the driveway. Jake's ex-girlfriend's sister, Mia, handing him a crumpled hoodie. "Liz didn't want you thinking she kept it on purpose," she said, her tone clipped. Jake muttered thanks, but as soon as her car left, he sprinted upstairs. His door slammed, and within minutes, I heard muffled sobs through the wall. Part of me wanted to throw his words back at him. "It's just a hoodie. Man up." Instead, I dug a sympathy card out of my desk, the kind people send after funerals. On the front, it said, "Thinking of you." Inside, I wrote, "Sorry your hoodie outlived your relationship." Dad found the card taped to Jake's door the next morning. His face flushed red. "You think this is funny?" he barked, waving the card like evidence. Mom stood behind him, arms crossed. "Both of you need to stop," she said, but her voice wavered. Jake's revenge came fast. That weekend, he accidentally donated my favorite pair of sneakers, black high tops I'd saved for months to buy. "Must have mixed them up with the trash," he said, shrugging. I didn't cry, just stared at the empty spot in my closet where they'd been. That night, I snuck into his room, not to steal, just to, I don't know, understand. Under his mattress, I found a half-empty vape pen, the sweet, fruity smell clinging to the fabric. I held it up to the streetlight filtering through his blinds. Stress relief, I thought. The next morning, I dropped it on Dad's toolbox in the garage. "Check his lungs before judging my attitude," I said when Dad picked it up. He frowned, turning the vape over in his hands. "We all cope differently," he said finally, slipping it into his pocket. Mom started talking about the weather forecast. Jake's still suspended. I'm still grounded. But every Saturday, I walk to the shelter, and for 2 hours, Rusty lets me forget that my brother hates me and my parents don't know how to fix it. Last week, Marisol let me feed him. His tail thumped once, a tired wag, but a wag all the same. I took a photo of his muzzle pressed against my knee, made it my lock screen. Jake hasn't noticed yet. I don't know who's right anymore. Maybe we're all wrong. But when Rusty licks my hand, I let myself pretend just for a second that Buddy sent him to make sure I'm okay. It's been a week since I posted. Nothing's better. Nothing's worse. We're just stuck. Now for the second update. 3 weeks since my last post. Turns out, hitting rock bottom doesn't always mean things stop falling. Jake got fired from the mechanic shop after failing a drug test. When he stormed into the house, his boots tracking grease on the carpet, he pointed at me like I'd pulled the trigger. "Happy now, snitch," he spat. Mom hovered in the doorway, her knuckles white around her coffee mug. Dad just stared at the floor, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. That night, their voices seeped through the walls. Dad's low and fraying. "You're coddling him?" Mom's sharp and wet. "He's hurting, can't you see that?" I pressed Buddy's old leash to my chest, the metal tag digging into my palm. Jake started disappearing. Not literally, but he'd vanish during meals, leave half-empty plates in the sink. One night, I woke to the sound of retching down the hall. The bathroom door was cracked, and I could see Jake's hunched silhouette, his forehead against the toilet seat. The sour tang of vomit mixed with something sweet, almost medicinal. I didn't ask if it was guilt or last night's vodka. Some questions don't have answers you want. The shelter called about Rusty the next morning. "He's being adopted," Marisol said, her voice soft. "Come say goodbye." I sat cross-legged on the floor of his kennel, my knees bumping his bony ribs. Rusty laid his head in my lap, his breath hitching like even breathing took effort. When the new family clipped the leash on him, he didn't look back. I cried on the bus home, silent tears that felt like betrayal. I should be happy for him, I thought. But all I could taste was salt. Jake was waiting at my bedroom door. His eyes were bloodshot, his hoodie reeking of stale smoke. "You happy now?" he muttered. "I'm a loser, just like you wanted." He said it like it was a fact, like I'd carved it into him. I shoved past, my shoulder clipping his. "I just wanted you to miss Buddy too," I said. The words hung there, limp and small. He didn't follow me. Mom found Buddy's collar in the kitchen trash the next day, the blue fabric stained with coffee grounds. She stormed into Jake's room, her slippers slapping against the floor. "How could you?" she shouted. I'd never heard her raise her voice at him, not really. Jake's reply was a muffled, "Whatever." But when Mom slammed his door, the sound shook the hall pictures. Dad cornered me after dinner. He stood in my doorway, his hands jammed in his pockets like he was afraid they'd betray him. "Why can't you two just—" He trailed off, his throat bobbing. I waited for the usual script. Be the bigger person, family first. Instead, he rubbed his face and said, "I didn't get it. Losing a dog, it's like losing family." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was the first time he'd looked me in the eyes since Buddy died. Mom let slip that Jake started therapy. "He says you need it more," she added quickly, like she was handing me a grenade. I just nodded. That night, I caught Jake lingering by my desk, his gaze stuck on Buddy's photo, the one where he's mid-leap, chasing a frisbee. Jake didn't say anything, just left, his footsteps too loud down the stairs. Then came the TikTok. Jake's ex Liz posted a video with her new boyfriend, some guy with perfect teeth and a surfer's tan. They were at the beach, lips locked as waves crashed behind them. Jake stared at his phone for a full minute, his thumb hovering over the like button. Then he chucked it into the driveway. The screen shattered into a spiderweb of cracks, glass glinting under the porch light. Mom made him pay for the repairs using his unemployment checks. "Responsibility starts now," she said, her voice trembling. Jake didn't argue. 2 days later, I found a folded note in my backpack. The paper was torn from a gas receipt, the words scrawled in Jake's blocky handwriting. "I'm sorry about the bowl, Jay." I read it 3 times, waiting for the punchline. When none came, I tucked it into Buddy's old collar, hidden under my socks. I left Jake's vape pen on Dad's toolbox again. No drama, no confrontation. Just set it next to the socket wrenches and walked away. Dad hasn't mentioned it. Maybe some truths are too heavy to lift. Then the shelter called. Rusty's adopters returned him. "He's too old," they said. "Doesn't play with the kids." Marisol's voice crackled through the phone. "We thought, given your bond." I didn't let her finish. Used the lunch money I'd saved, $27 in crumpled bills, and took the bus across town. Rusty wagged his tail once when he saw me, a tired thump against the kennel floor. Dad helped me build a doghouse in the backyard. Jake wandered out at one point, watching us nail the planks. He didn't offer to help, didn't mock us either. Just stood there, hands in pockets, until Mom called him in for dinner. We're not okay. Not even close. But when Rusty curls up at the foot of my bed, his snoring a steady rhythm against the silence, I let myself imagine a world where not okay is just a phase, where brothers can grieve in the same language, where parents learn to listen. 3 weeks in, and we're still a mess. But maybe, we're a mess that's starting to dry. Now for the final update. 3 weeks since my last update. Honestly, part of me didn't want to write this. Some wounds scab over better when you stop picking at them. But here we are. Jake started at the pet store 2 weeks ago. He came home smelling like cedar chips and that weird herbal shampoo they use on the guinea pigs. The first night, he tossed a squeaky hamburger toy onto my bed where Rusty was snoring. "For the grandpa dog," he mumbled, already halfway out the door. It wasn't an olive branch, more like a twig, but Rusty's tail thumped once, slow and skeptical, and Jake paused in the hallway like he was waiting for a verdict. The vape pen finally blew things up. Dad found it in his toolbox, wedged between the wrenches like a guilty secret. He cornered Jake in the garage. I heard the clang of a dropped oil pan, Dad's voice cracking. "You want to end up like your Uncle Frank?" Jake didn't yell back, just stood there, grease streaked down his forearms, staring at the floor. Later, he told Mom, maybe I deserved it, and she cried into a dish towel. I found her like that, shoulders shaking, whispering, "I just wanted you boys to be okay." We built Rusty's doghouse last Sunday. Dad measured the planks wrong 3 times, cursing under his breath. I held the nails between my teeth, the metal bitter and cold. Jake wandered out at some point, hands shoved in his pockets, watching us wrestle the roof into place. He didn't offer to help, didn't sneer either, just stood there, kicking at a dandelion, until Mom called him in for lunch. When we finished, Rusty sniffed the fresh wood, peed on the corner post, and trotted back inside. Some endorsements are quieter than others. There's a photo of Buddy on my desk now. Jake's the one who dug it out of the storage bin. A shot of Buddy mid-leap, chasing a frisbee. I caught him staring at it last week, his finger brushing the frame. He was faster than he looked, Jake said, and for a second, I thought he'd say more, but he just walked out, his boots heavy on the stairs. The apology happened on a Tuesday. Rain smeared the windows, and Rusty was snoring through a squirrel documentary. Jake leaned in my doorway, a crumpled gas station receipt in his hand. "I'm sorry about the bowl," he said. Not, "I'm sorry," but close enough. He didn't meet my eyes, just set the note on my dresser and left. I didn't tell him I'd already known. Mom fished the bowl out of the trash the day after he threw it. She'd been hiding it in her sewing kit, the chipped ceramic wrapped in tissue paper. Dad's trying. He hung Buddy's collar from the rearview mirror, the tags jingling every time he turns. "So he's still with us," he said, adjusting it 3 times until it hung straight. Last week, he brought home a framed print of a golden retriever silhouette. "Saw it at Costco," he muttered, setting it beside the TV. It's cheesy, cliché, but Rusty peed on the corner of it yesterday, and Dad laughed. Actually laughed, for the first time in months. Jake's still Jake. He blasts his shitty metal music, leaves milk cartons empty in the fridge, but when Rusty hacks up a hairball on his shoes, he doesn't kick the wall anymore, just sighs, classy, and grabs paper towels. Progress is a quiet thing. We scattered Buddy's ashes yesterday. His favorite park, the one with the muddy pond he'd cannonball into every spring. Mom brought a Ziploc of his favorite biscuits. "For the road," she said, her voice wavering. Jake carried the urn, his arms stiff like it might bite him. When the wind kicked up, ash dusted his sleeves, and he didn't brush it off, just stood there, staring at the water. Rusty licked Jake's hand on the walk back. Jake froze, his fingers curling like he'd been burned. "Dogs are too good for us," he muttered. "Not to me. To the air, maybe. To whatever part of him still wanted forgiveness. We're not okay. There's no montage moment, no hug-it-out climax. But last night, Jake left the pet store with a dented bag of dog food they were going to toss. "For the grandpa," he said, dropping it in the garage. Rusty licked his shoe. Jake didn't pull away. 3 weeks ago, I'd have called this a lie. But grief's a weird glue. It doesn't fix what's broken, just holds the pieces together long enough to dry. We're not a family that talks. We're a family that builds doghouses and leaves notes on gas receipts. That's enough. For now, it's enough.